Hey everybody, Dr. Ben Edwards here in Lubbock, Texas at Veritas Medical. Thank you for joining us today. I've asked Morley Robbins to take a little bit of a dive into the vitamin D topic. So that's what we're going to talk about today. It is May the 19th, 2021. Still talking about COVID, unfortunately. We're not going to try to go off too much on that tangent today. However, that is kind of the driving force behind the conversation because everybody's talking about vitamin D. And many of my patients in the general public are asking me, well, why don't you have vitamin D in your protocol for this? What's wrong with taking vitamin D? And we've talked about this many times on the radio show, You're the Cure, and Morley's talking about it ad nauseum all over the place. But I wanted to maybe concisely bring together the main points so we can just point patients and the general public to this as a resource and answer some of these kind of questions. So Morley, thank you for joining today and bringing your knowledge and your science to back up these recommendations that we make. That really helps people. You know, there's a kind of a caution here of making science God or putting up on this pedestal as a religious thing versus having some knowledge. And kind of just a little background, my perspective is always going to be, okay, 100 years ago, you know, Weston A. Price saw healthy people all over the world that were not succumbing to infection and cancer and heart disease. And these people were not taking supplemental vitamin D, nor were they doing a lot of other things, meaning we had this innate natural ability for our body to just function like it's supposed to function, ward off germs, cancer, and other chronic diseases of inflammation. We know this is how the body's designed because historically we didn't deal with these things. When the internal terrain is disrupted, our immune system is disrupted, then we're vulnerable. We're like a petri dish, just an open, you know, welcome sign hung out on our door saying, come on in, germs, cancer, chronic inflammation leading to all these different metabolic diseases. So anyways, if we weren't taking it ancestrally, we weren't taking these supplemental forms, do we really need to? You know, maybe we do. Maybe there's something missing in today's modern world where we just have to use some synthetic supplementation, possibly. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Morley, I want to try to keep this short, sweet, and to the point. I do want to say Morley has a master class in this. If you want to take a deep dive, and we'll put a link to that, I encourage you to do that. If you need that like that, you're a more scientific-minded person that just wants to get in deep, take Morley's whole class, his whole series, and take the master class. I'll let Morley speak more to that. But Morley, any opening comments before we dive in? Anything about COVID? I know you have a lot to say about COVID. We might make another video on that, but feel free to touch on or introductory comments.
Well, I think it's important. Thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. And in all candor, when Dr. Ben reached out to me, I kind of winced. It's like, do we have to do this? But I understand the importance of it. You know, there's a constant need to educate and re-educate and validate. But I think as a backdrop, here we are, you know, again, it's May 19th. We're 15 months into this PSYOPs, and I use that word deliberately. This is a manipulated situation. It's a contrived, it's a statistically driven situation. And while some may find that offensive, the truth is beginning to reveal itself. And yes, people did get sick, and yes, people did die, unfortunately. But every year, people die and get sick from the flu. All this was another annual update of the flu virus. So it got a different language around it. But I think what's happened is we have been hoodwinked with information and narrative, and what Dr. Ben and I are devoted to doing is making sure people have the best available information to make the best decisions. And yes, our stance on this supplement runs contrary to a lot of very noteworthy people in both the traditional and the alternative fields of medicine. But we have both a solid commitment to our maker, but also understanding science as well. We've not abandoned either one in this process. And so we just want to share this information and allow you to use your discernment to decide to what extent does this influence or maybe even reshape your position on the role that this supplement may or may not play in your health and your immune system.
That's great. I'm glad you brought that up, because our purpose, really my purpose, is education. I feel like and it is the root word of the word physician, the Latin root of that's a teacher. And if we can present information, present what we do know as up to this point in our scientific understanding, and then use your discernment, use your individual God-given discernment to decide what's best for you right now in this moment. And we'll get into this in a second, but sometimes we elect to use symptomatic relief, I'll say, whether that's pharmaceutical symptomatic relief or nutraceutical, natural things to relieve symptoms. But you need to understand there's potential unintended consequences of that. Now, if you have not stewarded your health for 60 years and you find yourself in the middle of a firefight, you might need some fire suppressant in the moment, possibly in your condition. You may need some steroids, you may need some other things in that moment, but that's different than long-term chronic use of something. So individualized approach with knowledge and discernment. So that's a great point, Morley. Let's dive in. Let's see what this hormone D, which we're going to call it that because it is a hormone. Everyone's used to saying vitamin D. We're going to call it hormone D. So let's go with this hormone D presentation.
And again, real quick, what we've got are it's 10 slides taken from, as Dr. Ben pointed out, there's a master class that was done in the fall of 2020 that covered 5 different topics. One of them was devoted to vitamin D metabolism. And I would encourage anyone who wants to take a deeper dive to access that. It's behind a paywall on the rootcauseprotocol.com or RCP123.org website, and you can take a very extensive journey into a lot more research than what we're going to be able to cover in this brief time together. Let me get my slides to work here. So a lot of people are very preoccupied with signs of what they call vitamin D deficiency. And what we're really calling to question is it really deficiency? And what we're going to cover in this series of slides is probably going to be a little bit different than what you're used to hearing. So just kind of brace yourself for some new information. There's a lot of robust information, but it's important for you to at least be aware that there's more to the story. That's really, I think that's the most important thing that Dr. Ben and I want to make sure is that you know there's more to the story. You're focusing on a narrative, and we're trying to expose you to a broader spectrum of the story. So a very dear friend of mine, Joey Foster, taught me this very important phrase: missing information equals missing truth. It's probably the most important thing to understand about healing on the planet today. A lot of practitioners have missing information. And so one of the first hormones to appear on planet Earth a long time ago, something called vitamin A, it's called retinol, and it's a light sensor. There's that big giant orb out there that we call the sun, and life forms needed to figure out how to get work done in the presence of that light. It's very, very important. And as we know, it's light and then it's dark, and it's light and then it's dark. And retinol was designed to allow the life forms to sense that light and take advantage of that light. Then along came, many, many years later, something called vitamin D or hormone D, and it's a light filter. It's very different than a light sensor. And so sunglasses block the light. And that's what it does inside our body. Again, if you look at all the articles, all the blog site articles about vitamin D, they always have a picture of the sun with sunglasses. And it's a hint. It's blocking the light. And so we have retinol is aware, and calcidiol is kind of dumb. And we'll get into that in a minute. So there are two important properties of sunshine. We can't live without the sun. Sun is absolutely essential for life on the planet. We know that. And as it relates to these two hormones, it's absolutely critical. But all you know is one half of the story. you know that sunlight is critical to activate the synthesis of vitamin D. And all of these transactions that are being highlighted in red are really dependent on one mineral called magnesium. So if magnesium is being lost to stress, and that's a biological fact, anytime we have stress in our lives, we're losing magnesium, goes into our urine, goes into the toilet, and we got to restore it and replace it. And so, truth of the matter is, if your storage D, which is what doctors measure, if storage D is low, it's because magnesium is low. That's an important thing to know, and we'll emphasize that again in a minute. But the other action that's taking place on this planet in the presence of sunlight, and I would argue is probably 100 times more important, is the breakdown of retinol into what are called retinoids. It's a whole series of chemicals that run our body. There are what are called retinoic acids, and there's 4 of those that are incredibly powerful. And then we have what are called nuclear receptors that are critical in gene regulation, and it really runs the metabolism that runs our body. These retinoids are profoundly important, but nobody talks about those because we are suffering from dementia. We're not aware. And what we're trying to do is raise your awareness of the importance of balance and broader understanding. Yeah, go ahead.
In this part, so sunshine activates both of these, in both these slides here, the retinol and the D. Is this where that 10-to-1 ratio comes in, or is that more in the dietary forms like cod liver oil where there's D to A and 10-to-1 ratio, or is that also here with the sunlight metabolic?
There's no question that within the food system, there's always higher levels of retinol, especially as we see it in cod liver oil, and even in liver. The liver function. The primary function of the liver is twofold: store copper and store retinol. It has been turned into, in the modern era, an iron storage locker, which is very disruptive. I don't have command of the amount of retinol by food substance, but what's important for the listeners to understand is that there's a difference between beta carotene and retinol. Beta carotene is vegetable source vitamin A. Retinol is an animal source of vitamin A, or we should be calling it hormone A. But the important thing is that there's something called retinol equivalency units, and it takes 12 beta carotene to equal 1 retinol. 1 molecule of retinol is the equivalent of 12 beta carotene. So you need to eat a bag full of carrots to equal 1 tablespoon of cod liver oil. And so there's an efficiency that comes in Mother Nature through these animal-based forms of fat-soluble hormones. And that's what we're really trying to emphasize.
Okay, perfect.
So what is low vitamin D really? Well, we've been trained, like circus bears, to believe that vitamin D is a fuel gauge. It's low or it's high, it's empty or it's full. That's the driving mentality in the world today. This is very binary. Oh, it's either on or off, it's low or it's high. That's not how the body works. The body is a lot more sophisticated than that, but it's not too sophisticated. Instead of it being high and low, it's miles per gallon. So when was the last time, Dr. Ben, that adding more gas to your truck improved its miles per gallon?
I wish. I'd keep it topped off all the time.
It just doesn't work. And what we understand about miles per gallon is we know there are multiple variables involved. Are the tires inflated right? Are the fuel injectors getting the proper mix of gas and oxygen? Are all the sensors working the way they're supposed to? And ironically, our cells are very much like our car engines. They need fuel and oxygen that need to be mixed together in order to have an explosion. And this has been completely fuzzed out, and we don't understand how to properly measure this. And so the stance that we take is that adding a soy-based supplemental D to a body that has high iron and low magnesium, because they go together, well, that's going to be a violation of the metabolic integrity and the metabolic pathway to create storage D. Again, it's just, that's the struggle on this planet, is that because we're under constant stress, we're going to be losing magnesium. And the inverse of that is going to be, we're going to be adding iron. And both high iron and low magnesium in the liver will block the enzyme function to create storage D. That's the important thing to understand, is that it's low for metabolic reasons, not low because it's empty. That's really what we're trying to say.
Right. If you're metabolically healthy, you would expect the vitamin D miles per gallon, what you're measuring, and maybe we'll get into this in the next slide, but this range of 20-ish, as opposed to, no, we need to be 50 or 80 or whatever.
Right. And there's research to challenge that mindset that we need to be higher, higher, higher. It's a misunderstanding of the data.
Okay.
Again, missing information equals missing truth. We have a very simplistic mind that if we take vitamin D, it's going to become storage D, but we don't really know that. This is a very important study that my friend Jim Stevenson Jr., who runs a Facebook group on Hormone D, brought to our attention, that actually taking the supplemental D, it can go a lot of different directions. And the direction we want it to take is this active form, the 125 dihydroxy D. Well, that's never assessed by the practitioners. You should stop and think about that. All they're measuring is the storage status, not the active status. That's a problem, because there needs to be a ratio of the two. And the form of vitamin D that the body really wants is sulfated. Very, very important. Sulfation makes it water soluble. Suddenly it's changing its properties because it's water soluble, and now it can begin to work its way through the cellular structure of the body, which is really where it's needed. So again, we have a very simplistic understanding of where the supplemental D that we're taking is going. And it's going a lot of different directions based upon the wisdom of the body and what it feels it needs in these other metabolites. So it's a lot more complicated than we want to think it is. And I don't think this is properly emphasized in the professional or the lay literature around this metabolite.
Right.
So this is maybe one of the most important slides, and there are only a few more slides, so bear with us. But I think what this begins to point out, again, more missing information equals missing truth. And this is beginning to show the hub and spoke of vitamin D and what the conventional practitioners have been taught is, oh, vitamin D is controlling all of this and it's all great. Well, we got to be really careful about the words we use. And so vitamin D is very good at blocking the function of the immune cells. And on the surface, that may sound like a good thing. But is that really what we want? Do we want to dull the function of our immune system? Is that really what we're trying to do? Or are we trying to energize our immune system, make it more aware, make it more intelligent about what's going on? And so what's happening, unfortunately, is this preoccupation now with hormone D is causing a suppression of the immune system. And there's a difference between suppression, which is what hormone D does, versus downregulation, which is what retinol does. Suppression and downregulation are completely different metabolic activities that is lost on a populace that's scared. And what we're trying to do is calmly explain that there's more to the story here. So Ben, you might want to comment on this a little further.
Yeah, when Morley showed me this slide earlier, it just made me think about steroids, prednisone in particular, and then some of these studies during COVID that have come out with vitamin D. in ICU patients or hospitalized patients, and you can reduce mortality and reduce ICU admissions. And kind of my layman's sort of explanation or simple mind of explaining that is just like prednisone or steroids. There's a study with budesonide, which is an inhaled steroid. When you have COVID, it can reduce your hospitalization by 90%. When you give someone a steroid shot, a steroid IV, steroid pills, there can be remarkable symptom improvement. And part of this whole COVID issue, the viral replication process stops pretty quick within a few days. It's this overreactive inflammatory response that sends people into the hospital and into the ICU. So steroids block inflammation, can be life-saving when you're really on fire and really inflamed, and we use them. And how I think about this vitamin D in some of these studies is the same thing. It may have some very big suppressive effects, some ways to tell that immune system to calm down when it's overreactive. And like I said at the beginning, there may be a time and place to use some life-saving symptomatic treatment. But using it preventatively, using it every day, using it chronically long-term, all year long, for the rest of your life, unintended consequences, just like steroids. If you stayed on steroids every day for the rest of your life, doctors know this, lots of unintended consequences. You get brittle bones, you get diabetes, you get ulcers, you get all kinds of metabolic chaos. So we have to be careful on this suppression in an acute sick setting where a doctor may choose or a patient choose to do that, just like steroids. So I want to point that out. The doctor in me is always going to assess the patient in front of me and decide what am I going to choose from of all the tools in my toolbox. And when we need some life-saving suppression, we may do that. It's totally different than taking this every day.
Very, very well said. So this next slide is very full and meaty. We wanted to give you, again, a very significant set of facts that to your benefit, if you want to dig deeper, there's all sorts of additional information, but this begins to highlight in large part why Dr. Ben and I are so cautious and concerned about this particular component of what people are deeming as the most important thing to do to avoid COVID. It's like the most important thing is to create energy. That's the most important thing, but we'll get into the details here. So everyone's concerned about low vitamin D. Again, let's not forget that it's not a fuel gauge. It's low miles per gallon. There are metabolic reasons why it's low. It isn't because the gas tank is low. And the question that's not being asked by enough practitioners is, why is it low? That's the question. Why? It's not just, oh, we just got to fill it up. No, let's understand what might be the variables that aren't working right, that are causing this expression of this storage D to be low in the liver. So Dr. Mohammed Amer at Johns Hopkins did a very important study in 2013 and found there was no clinical benefit to having storage D above 21. This, of course, flies in the face of the work of Dr. Hollick and all the other studies that say, no, it's got to be closer to 80 to 100. Well, the research that Dr. Amer put together is very impressive, and it really forms an important bedrock of understanding that maybe there's more to the story. Second, Dr. Dang at NIH did a very important study in 2013 about revealing that, in fact, hormone D metabolism is magnesium dependent. There are 8 enzyme functions that require magnesium as it relates to regulating the status of vitamin D. Both its activation and its deactivation are magnesium dependent. That's an important thing to know. Very, very significant study done a year later, 2014, by Meg Mangan, highlighting the fact that low vitamin D is really a billboard for high inflammation. That's the part that everyone misses, is that, what? Oh, I thought that low vitamin D caused the problem. No, it's just a billboard saying, hey, we've got high inflammation. What are the metabolic requirements for high inflammation? You got to have a lot of iron, and you got to have a little bit of magnesium, and then you will have inflammation. That's a proven metabolic fact. And probably the scientist who did the best work on that was William Weglicki at George Washington University in 2009. He completely redefined, 1992, 1992, did a whole series of studies to prove that low magnesium equals high inflammation. Well, low magnesium also equals low vitamin D because the enzyme doesn't work right.
Right, and this is a great time to make a point. So many of these studies with COVID and other things, people with low vitamin D, they end up in the ICU at a higher rate. Okay, Morley just said correlation versus causation is what we're talking about here. So if vitamin D is a billboard saying you're inflamed, then of course you're going to be more likely to end up in the ICU. Inflammation is, a sign of a dysfunctional body, a dysfunctional immune system, dysfunctional physiology in general. This is a good example I like to throw out is when, if there was a study that showed people that eat ice cream cones die from drowning more often, that's like saying an ice cream cone is going to make you drown. No, of course not. But people eat more ice cream in the summer when it's hot, and they tend to swim more then, and so there can be this correlation. Flies don't cause garbage, but they come to the garbage. They don't cause it, but they're correlated. They're there. Firemen don't cause the fires. You'll always find a fireman in a fire truck at the fire, but they didn't cause it. So there's a signpost, a marker, a billboard, correlation versus causation. So continue, please, Morley. This is awesome.
One of the most important things to understand is the difference between correlation and causation. Very well said. So this is a very important study that was done many years ago. It seems ancient. I know, 1962. I was 10 years old when this study was done. It was done by Dr. John Ferris, demonstrating that supplemental D, taking vitamin D supplements, causes renal potassium wasting. Well, that's a very serious condition. It's done at a little school up in New England called Yale. And Dr. Ferris was a very important part of the faculty there. But what's important for people to understand is that if potassium is low inside the cell, it invites more iron into the cell. Iron is not your friend inside the cell. Trust us on that. So then we have supplemental D causing increased iron absorption and decreased production of ATP by Dr. Zager in 1999. So 37 years later, Dr. Zager was able to validate what Dr. Ferris was trying to warn us about in 1962. This is a very important study to begin to reveal kind of the deeper dimensions of what's really happening metabolically with this supplement. We begin to have evidence of why Dr. Mangan was able to reveal the connection between low D status and high inflammation. Iron drives inflammation, and that's a fact. Well, then a few years later, or actually a few years before Dr. Zager, it's an important study by Dr. Chow, where he was identifying that there was an increase in liver iron causing magnesium to drop and causing low storage D. Again, we're beginning to validate this premise, and it began to connect the dots by what Dr. Mangan found in 2014. Supplemental D blocks the absorption and the use of retinol. This is a very important aspect that there are receptors for these fat-soluble vitamins, and we've got to either take A or D. And if we start to flood the body with D, retinol can't get in. It can't be stimulated by the light in order to break down into the retinoids to do the magic that needs to take place. That's a very important thing to understand, is that we need both, and that's the beauty of these food-based forms that we regularly recommend. So people need to be a little less dogmatic and a lot more aware in their supplement routines. Supplemental D is not sulfated. I think Stephanie Seneff has done yeoman's work, a lot of important research and awareness about GMO, but I think this is probably one of the most important contributions, is to get people to realize that there's a difference between the form of vitamin D in a supplement and the form that the body prefers, which is the sulfated form, which makes it water soluble, completely changes its properties, and that little sulfate molecule is critical for the effectiveness of this metabolite. Back in 2007, Dr. Lappy and her colleagues at Tufts University did a very important study about vitamin D stopping cancer. And that became the mainstay of everyone's awareness that, oh, we've got to take vitamin D to stop cancer. Well, a decade later, to her credit, Dr. Lappy decided to restudy and reassess and reevaluate and found out that her original conclusions were invalid. It takes a very bold and integrity-driven scientist to make that kind of declaration, but she did. So I really commend her for that. No one's read the second study, though. Active D stimulates the synthesis of metallothionein. Well, that's just a protein. You may or may not have heard of it. It's a particularly important protein in the liver, and it's obviously, given the name metallo, it's working with metals. Well, what it does is it binds up metals. But what most people don't know is that it binds up copper 1,000 times stronger than it binds up zinc. Trust us. The reason why we're here, why we're working with this very fancy set of computers, is it takes higher intelligence and higher levels of energy production in order to make that happen. And that is only made possible by our mitochondria that are copper dependent. So when you're shutting down copper because of increased stimulation of metallothionein, that is not a good thing at all. And that's going to affect what Dr. Zager and Dr. Chow were talking about, directly affected. Then we have a very important study in 2014 where active D is something called a hepcidin antagonist. Now we're getting into some pretty esoteric science right now, but hepcidin is considered the hormone that regulates iron status in the body. Hepcidin is able to block the recycling of iron in the body. And when you're ingesting this steroid hormone that is causing hepcidin to overreact in the body, you are further compromising the iron recycling that needs to take place in the body, further validating the work of Dr. Zager and Dr. Chow. So again, the research begins to build on itself, and then we come to the coup d'etat. That there's a very ancient gene in our body called hypoxia-inducible factor 1, which works in the liver, and hypoxia-inducible factor 2, which works in the rest of the body. It's the oldest oxygen sensor in our body. And trust me, we need an oxygen sensor to know what's going on, because we can't make energy without oxygen. And what Dr. Ben Shoshan in Israel was able to prove in 2007 is that active D inhibits this conserved function of hypoxia-inducible factor. That should terrify everyone who's listening to this. It's not a good thing. And so this is just the title page of this study by Dr. Ben Shoshan. And what it highlights is that their results showed that active D, the 125 status, reduces the protein expression of both the regulated subunit hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha subunit and the vascular endothelial growth factor. These are two very important proteins in our body, and vitamin D in its active form was altering and changing their function in the body. That is not what you want to have proper, robust, natural immunity. So things that go bump in the night. 3 things to understand about vitamin D. This dietary supplement is really a hormone. I think we've made that point. It's officially called steroid hormone D. If you want to be a biochemist, that's how you would refer to it. And I think what's important here is that how many other hormones do you know that are sold over the counter? There are very few. And how many hormones ignore the active status of the metabolite? When doctors are measuring thyroid function, or they're measuring estrogen and progesterone and all these other really powerful chemicals, they're always looking at storage status and active status. But for some reason, we're ignoring the fact that this is a hormone, and we're ignoring the fact that there's an active status that needs to be measured as well. Secondly, hormone D dulls the function of retinol. We could spend 2 hours talking about the functions of retinol to broaden your understanding about what is happening in the body that's preoccupied with hormone D and doesn't understand what the role of vitamin A is. First and foremost, being the light sensor. And then finally, just to emphasize, this is not a dipstick function. We're not dropping in and say, oh, your D looks low. We need to recognize that it's a dynamic indicator of what's going on in the metabolism, especially what's going on in the liver. As soon as the storage D metabolite looks low in the blood, the first thing practitioners should think is, whoa, why is magnesium low? Whoa, what's the iron status in this liver if magnesium is this low to cause this level of vitamin D status? Those are the sequential questions that should be going through practitioners' minds who are more metabolically inclined, who are really fixated on the energy side of medicine, because that's really what's missing, is this broader awareness about it's energy deficiency that causes these symptoms to appear.
Yeah.
You want to comment on any of that?
Well, I do want to just remind everybody, this is really all about metabolic health. And what that means is your cell's ability to make energy and clear exhaust and do that efficiently. That's it. Why did the CDC say 94% of people that were labeled COVID deaths were really dying from underlying things, obesity, diabetes, heart disease? All these are all metabolic diseases. Cancer is a metabolic disease. Alzheimer's, you name it. I mean, almost every disease you can think of, when you boil it down, it's a metabolic disease. A cell can't make energy and clear the exhaust efficiently. That's what all this is about. It's what's going to predispose you to COVID and ICU and hospitalization and death and all that. It's really all the same thing, which is the beauty of the root cause protocol, and the beauty of a truly truth-seeking practitioner, I would say. Not that others aren't good people and trying to seek the truth, but you just keep asking why? Why are these things not regulated on their own? The body should be able to self-regulate. If you give it what it needs, avoid what it doesn't, it should be able to self-regulate. And giving it what it needs typically is going to be God food and God food-based supplementation, not synthetic stuff, not processed food-like substances either. That's another tangent I won't go on, but just to reiterate, the metabolic health is what we're after here. And synthetic D can obviously, as we've learned today, completely blow up metabolic health.
So it's a very different perspective than I think a lot of people had maybe at the outset of this conversation. Final slide. What we're being reduced to is what I think, I remember doing this with my children. I don't know whether Dr. Ben has done it with his, but there's a point in a child's development where you want to give them some power. And so you say, do you want to wear a red shirt or a blue shirt today? And the child thinks, well, I want to wear the red shirt. And they're really proud of the fact that they got to choose the red shirt or the blue shirt, right? Do you want the red shirt or the blue shirt? And that's basically what we're being reduced to in this country is, well, do you want a red candidate or a blue candidate? Or more succinctly, do you want to take hormone D or do you want to die of this COVID thing? And there's so much more to the story. There's so many levels of discernment that are needed, and we've got to transcend this mainstream media induced hyperbolic reaction to the headlines and really stand back and calmly decide what's the most important thing I can do for my system, for my immune system, so it has the metabolic robustness that Dr. Ben is talking about, so that it has the energy to think, the energy to act, the energy to overcome whatever the imbalance is. And we have that innate ability. And
Right.
our reading of the tea leaves and these research studies is that preoccupation with one supplement is overrated and misunderstood. I think that's how I would leave it.
I agree wholeheartedly. Thank you for letting that out so clearly. My closing comment is going to be related to fear, and you've kind of commented here, this choice of vitamin D or die. That's kind of what it's come down to. But you could relate that to anything. Take the vaccine or you're going to die, or whatever. This fear-based mentality,
Right.
turn it off. Who's ever using fear to encourage you to make a decision, turn that person off. Tune that out. Knowledge, discernment, that's where it's at. So Morley, thank you for bringing some knowledge. It's up to the people to get educated. And like we said at the beginning, Morley's got master classes, rootcauseprotocol.com, rcp123.org. Learn more. Go get more knowledge, but then use your discernment.
Right.
Morley, thank you.
Absolutely.
It's been a great talk. I think this will really help a lot of people to be more at peace when that intuition they have in them says, I need to go this way. The more natural way, this God-given way, how people were living 100 years ago. That's the right way to go. And now with this knowledge to help support that, they can stand up against the deception that's out there. So thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks for your time, Dr. Ben.
Okay.